Mercy Myrtle is one of the best characters in the show Jamestown, and this video will focus on her historic forebears. She single-handedly carries the series' humor and is played by Italian actress Patsy Merran. Her sunny disposition, Christian faith, innocence, and slow burn love life are a great contrast to the other female characters on this three-season show. Indentured servants like Mercy existed, and they were men and women who signed a contract, also known as an indenture or a covenant, by which they agreed to work for a certain number of years in exchange for transportation to Virginia, and once they arrived, food, clothing, and shelter. Adults usually served for 4 to 7 years, and children sometimes for much longer, with most working in the colony's tobacco fields. With a long history in England, indentured servitude became, during most of the 17th century, the primary means by which Virginia planters filled their nearly inexhaustible need for labor and contributed to the rise of the Chesapeake colonies, which would give birth to the colonial United States. At first, the Virginia Company of London paid to transport servants across the Atlantic, but with the institution of the headright system in 1618, the company enticed planters and merchants to incur the cost instead of the taxpayer with the promise of land. As a result, servants flooded into the colony, where they were greeted by deadly diseases and harsh conditions that killed a majority of newcomers and left the rest to the mercy of sometimes cruel masters and sometimes upward social mobility. There was no white privilege. The General Assembly passed laws regulating contract terms, as well as the behavior and treatment of servants. Besides benefiting masters with long indentures, these laws limited servants' rights while still allowing servants to present any complaints in court, and of course servants often just ran away. Servitude had a long history in England, like many countries, dating back to medieval serfdom. The Ordinance of Laborers, passed in June 1349, declared all men and women under the age of 60 who did not practice a craft must serve anyone requiring their labor, instituting an early economic model. Parliament updated the law in 1495 and 1563, with the latter version, the Statute of Artificers, still being in effect when the English founded Jamestown. Between 1520 and 1630, England's population more than doubled, from 2.3 million to 4.8 million, and Parliament hoped its 1563 statute might banish idleness, advance husbandry, and so deal with the new overwhelming number of poor and unemployed citizens. The population of England today is 67 million people. The founding of Virginia itself was partially in response to the perceived overcrowding of England. In his discourse on Western planting from 1584, Richard Hakluyt the Younger argued to Queen Elizabeth that new American colonies would energize England's decayed trades and provide work for the country's multitudes of loiterers and idle vagabonds. She seemed to agree, and you can watch her videos on this channel, and Sir Francis Drake sailed the world on missions under her reign. Jamestown, however, was named for King James I in 1607. It was previously known by the Powhatan River by Native Americans. In England, an indenture or contract for labor was known as a covenant merely personal and could apply either to farm laborers or apprentices learning a trade. Contracts generally lasted a year, after which terms were renegotiated. As the merchant and adventurer Sir George Peckham noted in 1583, many English men and women willingly became servants, in hope thereby to amend their estates, perhaps in reference to debt, and young children were sometimes bound to service by parents who would not otherwise be able to afford their upbringing with no social safety nets in place. While there was not necessarily a strong stigma attached to indentured servitude, The institution, first in England and then in Virginia, temporarily transformed poor men and women into chattel, or property to be bought and sold by virtue of contracts. The Virginia Company of London always had more land than labor to work it. At first, the company attempted to entice investors by offering them shares in the company that were redeemable for land. But people failed to invest, and the colony became infamous for its high mortality rate, so the company began shipping servants to Virginia at its own expense and placing them on company-owned land. Once the servants arrived, the company could rent them out to planters for a year at a time, requiring the planters to take responsibility for the workers' food, shelter, and health, and after the year was up, the servants would renegotiate their contracts. These were all whites. With the introduction of marketable tobacco, demand for labor skyrocketed. You can learn more about tobacco as currency in its video on this channel, and it was a very important part of the colonial economy. Private investors who, alongside the Virginia Company, had shipped servants at their own expense continued to do so, while the company rid itself of its role as rental agent and focused on its people. Instead, it sold servants directly to planters at a price based on the cost of passage. Planters, mariners, and merchants then fixed the years of service for the servants from a year, based on the labor required to recoup their purchase price and subsequent care. Servants ranged from convicted criminals to skilled workers, and they occupied the lowest rung on the social ladder in Virginia, but this could change. While tenants kept half of what they earned, servants kept nothing until they were released, and were almost entirely at the mercy of their masters for the terms of their indentures. Movement up the ladder was limited, even once a term of service had been completed, although servants with marketable skills had some success. Few servants were like Robert Townshend, who arrived as an apprentice in 1620 and became a colonel, and then served in the esteemed House of Burgesses. However, the social mobility of this servitude system cannot be discounted, as many carpenters and other skilled laborers worked up as well. In the summer of 1620, the Virginia Company of London announced it would send to Virginia at public cost 800 choice persons, half of whom were assigned to be tenants of company land. 100 young maids were sent to make wives for these tenants, and 100 boys were to serve as apprentices. Finally, 100 servants were to be disposed amongst the old planters, which they greatly desire, and have offered to defray their charges with very great thanks. The public payment for these costs helped the English feel connected to Virginia, which continued well into the Civil War. Soon, however, the Virginia Company found it unnecessary to continue incurring the public charge, or taxpayer-funded charge, transporting servants. Instead, it implemented a system by which it used the prospect of land to entice new colonists, and with them laborers. This was the headright system, first described in the so-called Great Charter of 1618. It awarded 100 acres of land each to planters who had been in the colony since May 1616, and 50 acres each to anyone who covered the cost of transporting a new British citizen to Virginia. In the show, this means Meredith Rudder, the brewmaster, would have added 50 acres to his hops fields for bringing over Verity, his fiery new wife. These newcomers, more often than not, were indentured servants, allowing successful planters simultaneous access to land and labor with no upfront cost to the Virginia Company. Merchants and mariners reaped a benefit too, for they recruited prospective servants from docks and neighborhoods, bargained their indenture terms with them, and then sold these contracts to planters in Virginia. The literacy of being able to read such contracts was very important and largely neglected. Merchants also accumulated headrights that could be used to acquire land. In time, these headrights or land certificates were bought and sold much like modern-day stock certificates. Sometimes groups of investors collectively absorbed the cost of outfitting and transporting workers to the colony. Virginia Company of London stockholders were entitled to 100 acres per share, and high-ranking officials were furnished with indentured servants as part of their stipend. In some instances, groups of investors promised to give land to their indentured servants after they fulfilled their contracts. The Society of Berkeley's hundreds investors offered their skilled servants parcels that ranged from 25 to 50 acres to be claimed once they had fulfilled their contracts. Various factors fueled the need for new servants. One was demographics. Approximately 50,000 servants, or 3/4 of all new arrivals, immigrated to the Chesapeake Bay colonies of Virginia and Maryland between 1630 and 1680. The ratio of men to women among servants in the 1630s was 6 to 1. Between 1640 and 1680, the ratio dropped to 4 to 1, but even then many men could not find wives to marry because there weren't enough women, and therefore could not establish families. As a result of this and the high mortality rate among new servants, company officials and English merchants constantly replenished the Virginia colony's servant population. Another factor creating a need for new servants was the rapidly expanding tobacco market. It created substantial opportunities for would-be planters, but tobacco is a demanding, labor-intensive crop, so it also required a large number of laborers. At the same time, tobacco's acceptance as a medium of exchange prompted planters to enhance their productivity. Between the 1620s and the 1670s, the annual output of tobacco per hand rose from approximately 710 pounds to around 1,600 pounds. During the same period, shipping costs decreased. Although tobacco prices had begun to decline sharply by late in the 1620s and continued to fall, production remained profitable because planters were able to produce larger crops with fewer hands. Yet even as they technically required fewer servants, planters demanded more. That's because tobacco consumption rose in response to lower prices, and planters eager to meet that demand increased their production. As indentured servants poured into Virginia, they came to account for fully half of Virginia's population. Such rapid change caused problems, however, and the General Assembly passed numerous statutes designed to address them. These laws served several broad purposes, including regulation of servants' contract terms, behavior, and treatment. Contract terms were important for several reasons. The Assembly wished to protect masters from terms that did not fully recoup their cost of transporting servants from England to Virginia, in addition to their subsequent care. If a servant died while in Virginia, this was a big expense, and so laws were necessary for the public welfare. The Assembly also faced the problem of servants who boarded ships and arrived without any contracts. The English custom of requiring a single year's service absent any other arrangement would not suffice in America, where the labor market was less stable and there was a lot of death compared to England. Finally, the masters, who included most men who sat in the Assembly, had an interest in prolonging terms of indenture because briefer service led to disruptive turnover, labor shortages, and an unstable workforce in agriculture. For these reasons, terms of service did not shorten even as tobacco production became more efficient and profitable. Instead, lengthy terms of service became customary and dictated by law. As early as 1619, the General Assembly required all servants to register with the Secretary of State upon arrival and certify him upon what terms or conditions they come hither. Custom houses were common then on the shore and kept a close eye on imports and exports, unlike today, so registering was not a problem. In its 1642 to 1643 session, the Assembly passed a law mandating that any servant arriving without an indenture and who was younger than 12 years old should serve for 7 years. Servants aged 12 to 19 should serve for 5 years, and servants aged 20 and older should serve for 4 years. Legislation passed a decade later in the 1657 session, and it adjusted these ages. Anyone under the age of 15 should serve until he or she turned 21, while anyone 16 or older should serve for 4 years. By 1705, the law was simplified further because the courts were crowded with people having to prove their ages, so that all non-indentured Christian servants older than 19 should serve until they turned 24. Christian servants generally referred to whites, Irish, and British. Lawmakers entrusted the county courts with judging the age of each servant, so Mercy's inability to know how long she had been at the colony in the show, because a court would have decided it for her, is accurate. In the meantime, the Virginia Company required slightly different terms for Irish servants, and they were advertised differently than British servants. The Assembly declined to dictate standard terms for privately negotiated indentures. As a result, contracts varied in length and specificity. By 1755, Thompson Mason, the brother of founder George Mason, simply filled out a form, which he did in order to indenture for 4 years William Buckland, a 21-year-old carpenter and joiner who was overseeing the construction of Gunston Hall. His agreement was somewhat unusual in that as a skilled worker he was paid £20 per year in addition to receiving all necessary meat, drink, washing, and lodging. Buckland was certainly worth the expense since Gunston Hall stands to this day. So this consistent narrative that everything in America was built with slave labor, repeated by the 1619 Project, among others, is totally false. Servants whose contracts had expired typically received freedom dues, which were a quantity of corn or goods and clothing. The 1705 statute was the first to explicitly mention this good and laudable custom, and required that male servants, upon their freedom, be supplied with 10 bushels of corn, 30 shillings, or the like value in goods, and a musket worth at least 20 shillings so they could defend themselves in wildlife. Women were entitled to 15 bushels of corn and the equivalent of 40 shillings more than the shillings value given to the men. During the 17th century, freedom dues were negotiated as part of the indenture and gave servants something to look forward to after their 5 years' service was up. Robert Coopy's contract, for instance, guaranteed him 30 acres of land at Barclay's Hundred. John Barnes, who purchased William Freeman, was obliged only to pay the boy his full due according to the custom of the country. Depending on the time and place, this might have included corn, clothing, and tools. In 1675, an indentured servant charged his master with cheating him and asked the general court to free him and pay him corn and clothes. The judges ruled in his favor, granting him 3 barrels of corn at the crop. Occasionally, the owners of indentured servants refused to release them or give them their freedom dues. At Jamestown, when a male indentured servant who had fulfilled his contract insisted on receiving his corn and clothes, his master exploded in rage and struck him on the head with his truncheon. It is not known whether he ever received his corn and clothes. In addition to contract terms, the General Assembly concerned itself with servant behavior. In The Whole Duty of Man, a Protestant devotional work published anonymously in 1658, the English author reminds readers that all servants owe their masters obedience, faithfulness, patience and meekness, and diligence. In Virginia, at least, such ideals were not always met. For instance, burgesses were forced to pass laws in response to servants who ran away, and to those who, still while under contract, hired themselves out to new masters under better terms. The court's refusal to get involved in private contracts ensured that this occurred for quite some time. The 1642 Assembly passed a law, which they revised in 1657, requiring that servants carry certificates and punishing any master who hired a servant without proper papers, something that we've seen incredible debate over today with the E-Verify system, which remains out of use throughout much of the United States. The Assembly was also perennially concerned with fornication, especially when it resulted in female servants becoming pregnant, which led to a loss of the servant's labor, for which the law attempted to provide compensation to the master. But this conflicted with the Virginia Company's desire for more people on the settlement. In some cases, female servants became pregnant as the result of relationships with male servants. Beginning in 1619, the Assembly tried to control this by preventing indentured women from marrying without permission, which would be given by a minister or a master. In 1643, the Assembly banned secret marriages between servants and added a year of servitude to both parties' contracts as punishment. The consistent modern argument that you cannot legislate morality is proven wrong here. Sometimes servants were singled out in the context of broader morals laws, such as against fornication, passed in 1661, which responded to servant pregnancies by requiring large fines to be paid to the local parish. If the master refused to pay, then the servants were to be whipped. Another law, passed in 1662, stipulated that the children of such pregnancies were to be handed over to the church, which would be reimbursed for its trouble by the reputed father, an early form of child support. If the father of an illegitimate child were a master, then according to a 1662 law, the servant would, upon completion of her indenture, be sold to the local parish for 2 years. This was to prevent such female servants who were termed loose persons from avoiding work throughout pregnancy and then attempting to leave their children in the care of their masters by running away. It also served to remove these women from the homes of the dissolute masters who impregnated them in an attempt to keep them safe. So the fear of the preacher in the show Jamestown is well founded. As the historians John D'Amelio and Estelle Friedman noted, masters could abuse the law by impregnating a servant and enjoying not only sexual advances, but additional servitude if the woman was not removed, according to the law. A number of these laws were combined and revised to impact this into an act of punishment of fornication and several other sins and offenses passed in 1696. Under this law, a woman servant who had a bastard child would be punished by having an extra year of servitude added to her contract or pay 1,000 pounds of tobacco to her master or mistress, but gone was the mention of dissolute masters. Servants ran away because their lives in Virginia tended to be nasty, brutish, and short. Although they often worked alongside their masters in tobacco fields, they usually lived apart and often under primitive conditions. They worked from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week through the growing season, which on tobacco and wheat farms could last from February until November. The mortality rate was very high, mostly due to what Virginians called the summer seasoning, a time during which disease killed a majority of new arrivals, likely due to mosquitoes and their carried illness. According to the Dutchman David Peterson de Vries, who visited Virginia in 1633, immigrants died like cats and dogs, while the sick want to sleep all the time, but they must be prevented from sleeping by force lest they die. In the meantime, servants, whether seasoned or unseasoned, were treated as property and subject to overwork and beatings by bad masters. For instance, in 1624, Alice Proctor, whom Captain John Smith termed a proper and civil gentlewoman, arranged for her runaway maidservant Elizabeth Abbott to be beaten, and the punishment was so severe that Abbott died. George Sandys, the colony's treasurer, allowed his servants to starve and languish for lack of medical treatment, while in 1649 a mistress was charged with thrashing her maidservant more like a dog than a Christian, so that her head was as soft as a sponge in one place and her back was possibly broken. Other female servants were victims of sexual assault. De Vries worried that servants were not treated with appropriate dignity as his fellow Europeans. I was astonished to observe of the English people that they lose their servants in gambling with each other, he wrote. I told them I had never seen such work in Turk or barbarian, and that it was not becoming Christians. Jane Dickinson was a servant living on the Martin's 100 plantation with her husband, Ralph Dickinson, when Opachicano Indians attacked in 1622. After killing her husband, the Pamunkey Indians held Jane Dickinson prisoner for 10 months until Dr. John Pott, a Jamestown physician and future Virginia governor, ransomed her freedom for 2 pounds of beads. Pott claimed Dickinson owed him both the remaining time on her late husband's contract and the time it would take her to reimburse him the ransom he paid for her release. In a petition from March 1624, Dickinson asked the General Court to free her, alleging that Pott's treatment of her was not much different from her slavery with the Indians. On at least 2 occasions, servants banded together to protest the way they were treated. In 1661, 40 servants in York County, angered by the lack of meat in their diets, conspired to rebel against their masters. In 1663, a group of 9 indentured servants in Gloucester County plotted to arm themselves and march to Governor Sir William Berkeley's home, where they would demand their freedom. In both cases, there were grasses, and the authorities were notified before the plans could be carried out, and the conspirators were punished. According to Berkeley, 4 of the Gloucester County conspirators were hanged for their actions, so men have literally died for your ability to eat meat. The General Assembly did pass legislation aimed at protecting servants from mistreatment. In a 1657 statute otherwise concerned with runaways, servants were granted the right to take to the courts complaints of harsh and bad usage, or else for want of diet or convenient necessities. In 1661, one act required sufficient diet and clothing to servants on their transatlantic voyage, while another prohibited cruel treatment once they arrived, with burgesses worrying that the fear had discouraged some servants from coming to Virginia and not working the land. In 1676, the Assembly further directed masters not to make bargains with their servants in an attempt to trick or manipulate them into extended terms of service. Other acts aimed to protect the rights of native servants. Like all laws, these laws were neither fully preventative nor always enforced, and they reflected the harsh reality of servitude in Virginia. Servitude in Virginia's tobacco fields approached closer to slavery than anything known at the time in England. The historian Edmund S. Morgan wrote, again, these were white servants in the Virginia tobacco fields. Men served longer, were subjected to more rigorous punishments, and were traded about as commodities, beginning in the 1620s. For much of the 17th century, those servants were white Englishmen and women, with some Africans, Indians, and Irish later on, but nothing like the fields of African slaves depicted by modern media, under indenture with the promise of freedom. By 1705, and the passage of an act concerning servants and slaves, slavery had become ensconced at all levels of Virginia society and was well on its way to completely replacing the indentured servitude system as the primary source of labor in the colony. Many historians explain this shift by citing either social or economic shifts in Virginia beginning around the 1670s. Morgan and others have argued that Bacon's Rebellion, which occurred in 1676, was the result of discontent among former servants. By harnessing that discontent and the name of racial solidarity, pointing it in the direction of enslaved Africans, white elites could create a more stable workforce and one that was less likely to threaten their own interests. Some whites were uncomfortable with other whites as servants, reflecting the racial consciousness of the time. Other historians observed the flow of English servants began to dry up, beginning in the 1660s, and fell off dramatically around 1680. And that forced planters to rely more heavily on slaves, which they then relied upon in the long term. Slavery did not end indentured servitude. The end of servitude gave rise to slavery. The historian John C. Coombs has suggested a third possibility. There was no trigger cause for the conversion. Instead, slavery expanded gradually as the British Empire grew, its role in the slave trade matured, and enslaved Africans became more available throughout Virginia due to the involvement of big banks than poor whites who had no problem moving up the social ladder if they could. By the 1670s, slaves had begun to replace white indentured servants among the Virginia gentry first, before both Bacon's Rebellion and the sharp decline in new white servants. Landowners and farmers preferred white servants for decades instead. By 1690, slaves accounted for nearly all of the gentry's bound workforce, but only 25% of the non-gentry. The gentry was also a much smaller portion of the colony's population and was populated by many Jews who owned the slave ships traveling to and from Africa. Over time, as the supply of enslaved Africans increased and their prices decreased, farmers and planters agreed that they could have a slave for life compared to a servant who had the hope of freedom. Even so, indentured servants, particularly those with specialized skills, and convict servants, continued to be imported to the colony throughout the 18th century. History such as this, which is published by the University of Virginia and others, is at stake today, with a bill SB 517 being advanced in the Virginia Senate. This bill would single-handedly wipe out Confederate and other Southern history resources in Virginia. Many bills like it are being proposed across the nation. So if you enjoy learning about this type of history, please ask your representatives to veto similar bills to SB 517 and SB 517 itself.